but they've always been part of the parish. But it was through that my mom and dad actually got married in the church at that time.
So they had not been married in the church prior.
Right. They had
prior
eloped in 1987.
Gotcha.
And after they got through some annulment things, they ended up getting married in the church when I was 8 years old. And so I was a ring bearer at my parents' wedding. But here's the coolest part. I know. My brother was the ring bearer at my uncle and aunt's wedding because they got married on the same day at the same ceremony at St. Luke on the grounds of the old church. So it was an outdoor Catholic double wedding. Crazy. And this is what I absorbed as a kid, right? So that was in 99, and a year later, St. Luke actually rebuilt. And so that was kind of the community that surrounded my family, and a lot of the deep sense of hope that I gained from that.
Yeah.
And again, there's so much to share, and I could go on, but I didn't want to just talk the whole time about everything, because again, there's too much to share in the story.
One thing that kind of popped into my mind when you were talking about St. Luke's burning down and how nothing was left but the Eucharist, and how in a sort of tragic situation, people banded together and found what was sort of the basis of their faith. Reminds me in a much lesser extent, and probably all of you know this, but 2 years ago at the parish I attend, St. Martin of Tours, which is open 24 hours, you probably all heard the story of a person in the neighborhood who I believe had some issues with drug addiction and so forth, had sort of cleaned up and then apparently fell off the wagon, just sort of forcing his way into the front doors one night and attacked the high altar and did, I think, $60,000, $70,000 worth of damage. And St. Martin's is open 24/7. And so through that night and the following day is, I think, the only time they've actually shut the church down in like 20 years. And it took quite a bit of time for things to be fixed, candlesticks to be mended, statues to be replaced. And so St. Martin's here in town is one of the really beautiful churches. It's very ornate, it's very old school, and it looked a bit more bare for a while. And I've always had a great appreciation for the visual beauty of the church, but it occurred to me as I began to go back to Mass there and things are a little more plain, that there is something to be said for that as well, because you can look at times in history when maybe under persecution, when people couldn't go into the beautiful cathedrals to celebrate Mass, or you look at monasteries where maybe there's just a very simple, plain wooden chapel.
Yeah.
And while the art and the beauty is designed to lift us up to God, and I think is good for that reason,
right,
it is sometimes good to remember when other things are stripped away, what really is at the root. Like, we are here just for the Eucharist. Like, that is the point of why we're here. So that definitely resonated with me when you were describing a more extreme situation. Entire church burnt down and all that is left is, outdoor Mass and Eucharist.
And that's why I think Christ came, not to abolish the old law, but to fulfill it, to help us understand, why do we gather bodily in worship at Mass in a physical building? It's not to tear down the temple and destroy it where it's irrelevant. It's to help us transform the temple so that we understand the ultimate temple when everything else is stripped, when we don't even have a building.
Right.
The ultimate temple is our body, our bodily presence in communion, not just community. Because if it's just community, I think we have a tendency to worship one another or worship a sense of feelings and emotion and excitement, and it can become unhealthy. But when you don't have any of that, you really do have to rely on your faith in God and to trust that God has put the right people in your life to communicate His love, His faithfulness, His spirit of endurance and fortitude that I firmly believe has become the very identity of my parish.
And in community versus communion, and I think that's really profound, because when you think of communion, we're going to think of communion in terms also of receiving the Eucharist.
Yes.
So when you're saying the temple is our bodily presence, but it has to be in communion, that's because we actually become part of the body of Christ. That's the fundamental temple.
Yes.
And Jesus says this himself when he talks to the disciples, and I think the Pharisees, about, if you tear down this temple, in 3 days I'll raise it up. It's a Gospel of John, I think. And John's little comment there is he was speaking of the temple of his body. So the Old Testament temple, if you want to understand all the interesting, peculiar things about the temple is the body of Christ. And then you look further and discover the body of Christ is everyone who is joined to Christ as well. So I think that's a good point, that it's not just community, but communion. If we really are the body of Christ, it is the receiving of the Eucharist that actually makes us truly the body of Christ.
Yes.
This slogan needs to change from unity in the community to union in the communion.
I like it. I like it. And on that note,
I kind of like unity in the Eucharist, healing in the family.
Yeah.
That's where I kind of
That's
go,
awesome.
but I like your attempt at a pun again.
I was half serious, half jest,
You're
but,
right, I know what you mean.
but I also appreciate that John already had another slogan in mind to replace it. He's like, that's great, but we've already decided on this.